Good evening. It's been a few days since I did this activity. I do have to say it was very enjoyable preparing and not having to think about Stan for about 45 minutes. It was yeah, maybe an hour today. I don't know. It was okay. I'm actually going to go back three lines from where he concluded shiur the other day, just to make sure that we are very clear on what it is that we are learning. So let's start at the two dots halfway down on Nun Dalet Amud Aleph, and Emir Tashem, we'll get to the Mishnah at the bottom of Nun Hey Amud Aleph, and then tomorrow we'll do as best we can. What is it? Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and then no shiur Wednesday, and then a Thursday I'm out of town. I have a chasna, Rabbi Reisman's daughter, Baruch Hashem is getting married, so I'll be out of town. Rabbi Muller's daughter, excuse me. Sorry.
Don't scare me.
No. I'm sorry. Rabbi Muller's daughter is getting married in Hashem, Baruch Hashem. And so Wednesday, Thursday are out. I'll try and get my brother to cover Thursday, but my brother's at the gala on Wednesday, so he can't help me. Okay, let's go. Tanan Hasam, we have a Mishnah in Maseches Uktzin, a well-versed Masechta for all of us. Let's say that we had Bisar ha'egel, we had meat from a calf, shenitpach. It was initially not the requisite shiur to be able to transmit tuma. We know within the halachos of tuma that in order for an item to transmit tuma to another item, the item that transfers must have a minimum shiur. But let's say that on its own it was too small, but then nitvach, it kind of absorbed water in the cooking process and got larger. Now it is a kibetza. A kibetza is the requisite shiur in order to transfer tuma. So now it was too small and got bigger, or the reverse. Ubsar zekena she nisma'ich, or there was an animal that was older. Again, I don't know what science they're talking about, but if there was an animal that in its original form was a kibetza, and then it shrunk in the process. I know we're used to seeing this. I just cooked a piece of meat on Erev Shabbos. It was a strip of London broil. It shrunk 15% just the second it hit they shrink. Whatever the case is, if they're cooking it with water, it can become more absorbed, whatever the case may be. So one way or the other. How do we look at that when we're measuring for tuma? Do we look at the initial measurement, or do we look at the closing measurement? So the Gemara says, Mishtar in the Kemos Shehain. We measure it as to how it is, but we don't know what this means. Do we say, and that was the Mishnah. Now the Amoraim argue about this. Rav, Reb Chia, Rav Yochanan. So let's say the camp of Rav. Amrei Mishtarin Kemos Shehain. Just look at it right now. What size is it right now? Right now, is it a kibetza? Yeah? Okay, then it transfers tuma. No? Okay, then it doesn't transfer tuma. Very simple. Shmuel Reb Shimon Bar Rebbe V'Reish Lakish. So the camp of Shmuel. So Rav and Shmuel, we're going to refer to them for the rest of the Gemara. So Shmuel says, no. Amrei, they say Mishtarin Lichemos Shehain. That extra lamed is supposed to be an extra lamed, but it's the same thing as the previous text. So on the side here, the Hagos Habach says the Chemos Shehayu, just like it was before. So Rav says we look at it with our own two eyes, Ein L'dayin L'masha and of Rose. Right now, this is what it looks like. And Shmuel says no, we go back to what it was initially. Machlokes Amoraim as to what the Mishnah and Uktzin meant. So now this is really where we're supposed to pick up for today. Says the Gemara Meisvei. Hold on one second. Bisar ha'egel. Let's say there was the meat of a calf. Shelo hayaba kashir. It was at its original less than a kibetza. The tafach ve'amad al kashir. And now you cooked it in such a way, it absorbed water, whatever the case. Maybe there was a neficha. It got more swollen, it absorbed more water. Now it is kashir. So then tahor l'chashavar. Because now it's requisite shiur. But that means that before it wasn't. So anything that it would have touched before it got to this shiur, meaning its original size, would be tahor l'shavar. The tamei mikanu lehaba, and this seems to be like Rav's shita, that we just look at it like it is right now, right? So says the Gemara, no. What would Shmuel answer? Midrabanan. We're not talking about dinei deoraisa. We are only talking about dinei derabanan. Says the Gemara, we're talking about dinei derabanan. That cannot be. Why not? 2/3 of the way down, because says the Gemara, ihachi. Had it been that we were learning about dinei derabanan, then what we just learned about Bisar ha'egel, the Mishnais and Uktzin, we have a big problem. Look at the next words in that brisa. Ema seifa, v'chein bepigul v'chein benosar. Oh, pigul and nosar. We spent so much time talking about pigul in Zvachim. And nosar, we spent less time talking about just an expiration date, but lemaisa, those are dine deoraisa. Iamris bishlama deoraisa. If you want to say that the din of the Mishnah and Uktzin, that we follow whatever it looks like right now, you want to say that's a din deoraisa? Hainu deika pigul v'nosar. Then I understand the continuation of the Mishnah and Uktzin that refers to pigul and nosar, which obviously are dine deoraisa. Elo iamris derabanan. If you want to say that when the Mishnah and Uktzin says we follow whatever we see, and be'enayim right now let's say it's larger than a kibetz and therefore it's tameh. If that's true that it's a din derabanan, well then pigul v'nosar b'derabanan mi'ika. How can you say that? There's no such thing as pigul that's derabanan or nosar that's derabanan. So the Gemara says, you're right. Pigul's a din d'oraisa. Nosar's a din d'oraisa. Inyane kares. And obviously, we've misunderstood something. So to this, the Gemara says, Ema, what should we say about that second part of the Mishnah in Uksin? Instead of saying that it's about pigul and nosar, it should say v'chein betumas pigul, v'chein betumas nosar, to say that, of course, nosar is going to be a din d'oraisa, but if the pigul or nosar meat touches something else, that's the rabbanon. You're right. The status of nosar becoming nosar or pigul becoming pigul, that's for sure a din d'oraisa. But if that meat that already became nosar pigul touched another piece of meat, that's when we say, like the Mishnah and Uksin, like Rav, that, oh, well, let's look at it. What is it now? What was it before? That's how we would answer up this question. So really the shiur is a shiur d'rabbanan, but it can apply to dine d'oraisa. And salkadai techamina. I might have thought that this wasn't true. I might have thought that we don't employ this din de rabbanan, as Rav puts it, that we, let's say that the Bisar Egel was less than a kizayis, and now after cooking it's more than a kizayis. Rav holds that's the rabbanan. We might have thought, I'm going to say this outside first because it's a little, just a drop complex. We might have thought that because it's a din derabanan, that when it swells to larger than a kizayis, that now it can transmit to whether that's derabanan. We wouldn't add it to another derabanan of what happens if nosar meat touches another thing. We would not have thought to combine them. Salkadai Tachamina, says the Gemara, 8 lines from the bottom of Nun Dalam and Aleph. I might have thought that hol b'tumas pigul b'tumas nosar derabanani, because not pigul and nosar, but the capacity for pigul or nosar to make something else tameh, that is a din derabanan, and kule hai b'derabanan lo avu rabanan, and we're not going to add another layer of derabanan like Rav says the Mishnah on Uksin is saying that, oh, now with nefichus the Bisar Egel is shaykh to create a transfer of tumah that's 2 derabanans. We would have thought you don't say that kamash malon, that we do. We're very machmer. So that's how the Gemara answers up, and therefore everything seems to be rational, like the Shita of Rav. Says the Gemara, well, wait 1 second, Toshma. Bisar zakena shahaya bo kashir v'tzamak pachos mikashir. Tzimukin in Hebrew are raisins. So let's say you have meat that shrinks, happens on the grill, happens almost in any case of heat unless you have it soaking in water, which is our experience in cooking by and large. So if you have a piece of meat that initially it was the right shiur, and now that you've cooked it, it shrunk. So the halacha is tameh l'sha'avar. Obviously, because earlier it was kashir, in that initial state when it was a beitza plus, kibetza plus, when it touched something, it's going to be tameh. It's also tahar mikanu lahaba. But now that it's vitsamuk, now that it shrunk like a raisin, it became smaller and it's less than a kibetza. So now it's mikanu lahaba. L'chora, the Rishonim explain over here, this seems to be even mide oraisa. That's what it seems like, that we would say that there's no tumah. It's one thing to say that it's tamei midrabanan, but to say that something's tahor by tyros, that means it's mutar midaraisa, right? So therefore, the Gemara says that this brisa indicates that Rav is wrong. Rav wanted to say the initial Mishnah in Uktzin was that when we go from a smaller shiur and with heating it goes to a larger shiur of a kibetza, that's a din derabanan. But the inverse implies that it's a din deoraisa, not a din derabanan. So then Rabbah has to clear the deck. Rabbah says, I'm going to redo this all for you so you have clarity, because we've obviously misunderstood something, and we are 4 lines from the bottom of the page. Amar Rabbah. Rava says as follows. Let's get all of the iterations clear. Kol heichadamei yikara hababei. In the beginning, if there was a shiur, the hashta lesbe, and right now there isn't a shiur, halesbe. Look at it right now. If it started at a beitza and a half, and with cooking it's zero point 0.9 of a beitza, look at it, measure it, and paskin on it. Whatever it is. That part's clear. V'chol heicha demei ikara lo hababe. The hashta hababe. Let's say initially it was 0.9, and now you soaked it in water and it reconstituted itself, and now it's 1.5 beitzas. So then, okay, the hashta hababe. Then midrabanan. Let's skip a line. No. V'chol heicha demei ikara lo hababe v'hashta hababe. Midrabanan. That will be the din that it is a din derabanan that it can transfer tuma. And as we turn to the top of Nun Daled Amud Beis, now we actually see a different framing of the machlokas between Rav's machane and Shmuel's machane. Kipligi, when is it that Rav and Shmuel argue? I'll tell you where. Kigon shahayabo kashir. Let's say initially it was 1.2 kibeitzim, enough to transfer tuma. Vitzamak, and then it shrunk in the cooking process, and then v'chazar v'tavach, you reconstituted it by adding water to it, you saturated it, and now it went from 1.2 to 0.9. Now it's 1.2 beitzas again. Now it can transfer tuma. This is where we have the machlokets Rav and Shmuel. Demar savar yesh dichui be'isura. Once we get it out of the camp of 1.2, once it goes below a kibetza, you can't put it back. Umar savar ein dichui be'isura. No, there's no such thing as permanently removing it, and if it reconstitutes, then it reconstitutes. This is the machlokas between Rav and Shmuel, says the Gemara. Totally different than our initial framing, which means as follows. What our havamina of the Gemara is that we had a machlokas when it went, Rav said we always follow the final volume, and Shmuel says we always follow but no. They both agree in both of those cases we follow the final volume. They only argue where it was big enough, 1.2 kibbetzim, it can transfer tuma, shrinks to 0.9, can't transfer tuma, then gets reconstituted and can transfer tuma. There they have a machlokas as to whether or not we go back to the original 1.2. Do we say that there's dichui be'isura, and therefore once it's been knocked off the pedestal of transfer of tuma, you can't reconstitute it? Or do you say you're allowed to? That's their machlokas. Asks the Gemara, hold on. 3 lines down. Are you serious? Do we have an opinion of yesh dichui be'isurin? Again, yesh dichui be'isurin means that it went from 1.2 to 0.9. Oh, now we can never reconstitute because yesh dichui, I pushed it away. Once I pushed it away, it can never come back. 1.2 to 0.9, it can never transfer to him again, even if I reconstitute. But it's none. How can you say that? After all, we have a Mishnah from Maseches Taros. The Mishnah says, Kibeitza ochlen shehinichu b'chama v'nisma'atu. You have a food that's a kibeitza, and you placed it in the sun, and due to the heat of the sun, the volume of 1.2 kibeitzas shrunk to 0.9, and then, says the Gemara, v'chein kizayis min ames, would there still be tuma of what was, again, whatever the shiur is? We were talking about transferring food, which it requires a shiur of a kibeitza. What? We'll get there in a second. Ukizayis min ames, kizayis min anevela, uche'adosha min asheret. If you have a tiny little piece of a sheret, uchezayis pigul, uchezayis noser, uchezayis chalev, and all whatever the requisite shiur is to make it tameh. If you put those things in the sun and they shrunk to 0.9 of their shiur, they're not a full shiur anymore, tahorin. In that moment they're tahor, but and if you ate them in that new state of reduced volume, there's no chiyuv. The initial volume was 1.2. I know, but I only ate 0.9. It shrunk. So let's say you cook a piece of ham. You cook a piece of mamash of chazer on the frying pan. The starting weight was 1 kizayis. The concluding weight was 0.75. So you don't get malchus. Why? Because it shrunk. So that everyone agrees to. We thought Rav and Shmuel argued there. They don't even argue. Everyone agrees to that. However, continues the Mishnah on Taros. The Mishnah says as follows. But if he nichan b'geshamim utfacho, let's say that it was very hot. It shrunk from 1.2 to 0.9. then it started raining, and you left it there, and all of a sudden it's reconstituted. We just said there's a shita that says that yesh dichui be'isurim, that once you go below your shiur, you can't reconstitute. What does our Mishnah say? That if it is reconstituted, tmeyin, even mideoraisa, v'chayav and mishum pigel v'chelav and osar. Tiyufta delman diomar yesh dichui be'isurim tiyufta. We thought perhaps the machlokes between Rav and Shmuel was whether or not we would allow for reconstitution once something went from 1.2 to less than to 0.9 of the shiur, and then it reconstituted machlokes. No, there's a machlokes there. Everyone agrees. The Mishnah and Taurus, you can't argue with a Mishnah if you're an Amora. So the Mishnayos have to be right. So what do we see? Mida Oraisa, this is true. Let's say that you did a machshavas pigul, and the amount of meat you did machshavas pigul on was 1.2 kizesim. And then you leave it in the sun, it shrinks to 0.9. If you eat it then below the Isser, no kares. If it rains and it's now neficha, it's 1.2 again, you're chayiv kares. What does that show you? You can't say yesh dichui be'isura. The haraya from the Mishnah and Tara said that's not true. So that can't be what the machlokes is about between Rav and Shmuel. And that rejects that shita. Doesn't unpack how we do understand the Gemara, but that is how the Gemara rejects one of those shitas.
No.
Good. 1/3 of the way down. Says the Gemara, Tashma, we think in the Havamin of our Gemara that we're talking about the din of Meiser. This is what we think we're talking about. We'll soon see we're wrong. But our Havamin is that we're talking about Meiser. Tashma. Here we have a Tosefta from Maseches Trumos. Te'enim are dates. Grogros are dried dates, aka figs. Aren't figs dried dates?
No.
No. Te'enim are figs. Te'enim are figs. Sorry. There you go. Grogros are dried figs. That makes more sense.
It's not about skill.
What did I say? That
There's Mattia.
dates are figs?
6.
Yeah, it's not very smart of me. It's okay. It's all recorded for posterity.
There's the
I haven't edited on any of my mistakes yet, so we're doing good. It's actually a terrible thing. I should edit my mistakes. Okay, so we have a fig, which is te'enim, or we have a grogris, which is a dried fig. So let's start this Toseft again. If I'm doing Meiser, Tormin, we're allowed to do Truma for te'enim al hagrogris b'minyan. You're allowed to take te'enim, which are ripe figs, and you're allowed to give Meiser, provided that it's b'minyan. You're not looking at volume, you're looking at number. So I have 100, I have 90 dried figs, and I have 10 ripe figs. I'm allowed to give the 10 ripe ones on the 90. If you want to say it's l'chamos shehayu, if you want to say that we look at their initial size, so says the Gemara, shehin misha'arin on shapir. I understand that because I'm giving 10 ripe figs against 10 dried figs. And even if the 10 dried figs were reconstituted, it would be exactly 10%. We're good. But if you want to say that we look at them like they are right now, then we have a major problem. Because I gave 10 ripe figs against 90 dried figs, shrunken figs. So the 10 ripe figs, their volume is more than 10% of all of the other 90 pieces. If you say that it's about l'chemoshein, to have a lemar b'maestros, that you gave more than 10%, that's a problem. Vitanya should say, let me just get the is it Vitanya? Yeah, Vitanya. And what do we say on this Tosefta? Hamar b'maestros peirosav mesukanim, but u'ma'asrosav mikulkalin. That's a problem. Your meiser is mikulkal. You're not allowed to do that. You can't make it that you're giving more than 10%. Now, there are other types of truma where we're going to discuss that in a minute. But when it comes to truma, you got to give 10. You got to give 10. You know, think about how we do animals. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Paint the 10th animal. We're very strict on it. So it says the Gemara, you're allowed to eat the other 90, but the 10 that you gave is mikulkal. So this is a beautiful raya. If you want to say we only look at the volume of the final product, So then Meiser in this case is messed up because what I did is I gave my 10 units from ripe figs, which are much larger than dried figs. And the 90 has a volume significantly less than what should be 90% of the figs. It's less than that by volume. So then we have Meiser's Mikul Kalam. Elamai, you want to say it's L'chemoshein. You want to say that it's like L'chemoshein like it was before. That's a problem too because Ein Seifa halfway down. Grogros al Tehanim. Let's reverse the case. Let's say I was giving Meiser from dried figs on ripe figs, but b'mida by volume. If you want to say that we're following the way things look right now, no problem. Why? Because the Gemara says that grogros are 10 units out of 90, and the grogros are 10%, even in their full form. If you're going to say that, then you have more than 10%, which is also not allowed. If you do it by volume, remember, so there's a nuance here. In the second part of the Tosefta, we're doing it by volume. So the volume is 10 units of dried figs against 10 pounds. We have to do it has to be a volume, 10 cubic meters or whatever of dried figs against 90 of the other. So when you're doing it by volume, it's perfect. But if you hold that we look at the grogros like they're original, then their volume is larger. And again, you have Meiser's Mikul Kalam. So the Gemara says that we're stuck one way or the other. Ella, says the Gemara, we're not talking about regular Meiser. You thought we were talking about Meiser, which is why in both cases, if we were to look at one of the shitas, it would look like the Meisers were Mikul Kalam because the 10 was larger than the 90 when it came to volume. So it says the Gemara, Ella, we weren't talking about Meiser. Says the Gemara, Hacha, B'truma Gedola Askinan. We're not talking about Meiser, we're talking about Truma Gedola. Rashi, Truma Gedola, 5 lines into the wide lines. Nitelis ba'ayin yafeh. The lo nitna Torah ba shiura. Umidoraisa chita achas poteres hakri. V'rabbanan amru. Ayin yafeh echad me'arbaim. Beinonis echad me'chamishim. Ayin ra echad mishishim. Alma nitelis ba'ayin yafeh. If you want to say that we're not talking about Meiser can be Mikul Kel if you give more than you should. But Truma Gedola isn't going to be that way. You can give whatever you want. The Chachamim said even one chita is poter sakri. You can give more, no problem. An ayin ra is 1/60th, it's less than 2%. Beinonis is 1/50th, that is 2%. And 1/40th is 2.5%. Fine. Says the Gemara, Ela hacha b'truma gdola askinan, v'reisha ba'ayin yafe, v'seifa ba'ayin yafe. In both cases, the reisha of the Tosefta that we spoke about, where you're giving te'enim on top of grogros, is more. No problem. No problem. Why? Because we're not talking about Meiser, we're talking about Truma Gedola. And you can always give ba'ayin yafe. The seifa too. Even if you were to give grogros, that had it been that you held that they were really looked at like their original of ripe, and therefore it's more than, doesn't matter if it's more than 10%, because at the end of the day, you can be Torah ba'ayin yafe when we're talking about Truma Gedola. Says the Gemara, hold on one second. If that's true, Ema Seifa, we have a problem. Amar Rebbe Lazar Rebbe Yossi. Abba, he says, my father, Rebbe Lazar's father was Rebbe Yossi. So my father, Hayanotel Eser Grogeros Shebemikzoa. It was like a processing, it was like a tool, or the art scroll said it was some kind of tool that was used. Rashi says 8 lines from the bottom of the page in Rashi's Mikzoa, Klisha nosnen bo hagrogros, al shem kli karilu ktzios bekama duchten. Has this language of ktzios. It was how they used to shrink a grogros. It was a dryer of some kind. Hard to know exactly what it is. Anyways, hayanotel eser grogros shebimikzoa al tishim shebekalkala. V'itru magdola eser my avidite. What did Rashi say was the ayin yafeh for Truma Gedola? 1/40th. What are you doing giving 1/10? The ayin yafeh has a measure from Chazal. Can't be we're talking about Truma Gedola. Elahacha, you're right. But Trumas Meiser askinan. Trumas Meiser is totally different. That's where the Levi would get, and of his portion he had to give 10%. The Abba Elazar ben Gomel, who, what does he say? The Tanya. Abba Elazar ben Gomel Omer, the Pasuk says, in Bamidbar v'nechshav lachem trumaschem, and the Pasuk continues, Kadogan min hagoren uchmaleya min hayakev, min hayakev. B'shtei trumos hakosim medaber, achas truma gedola v'achas trumas meiser. And what do we learn from these psukim? That kishem shetruma gdola niteles be'omedu v'machshava, just like a truma gdola can be approximated and it can be done without a maisa, it can just be done with your thought. I hereby in my mind, I'm not actually, right? One can say in their mind that they hereby feel and think, and therefore we have these halachos very, very sensitive by hilchot tzedakah. Let's say that you see a meshulach walking through the aisles, and you take out $1 to give it to them, and they leave. You're chayiv in tzedakah, right? And according to some poskim, even b'machshava you're chayiv in tzedakah. So Hirsch told me this. Hirsch Chen, he says he has a rule that he'll never get trapped by that because he made himself a rule that his kavana is that until the dollar reaches the hand of the recipient, it's not theirs. The machshava is not the machriya by him. He overrode. You can do that, but the default l'chora is like this: that just like by truma gdola niteles ba'omedu v'machshava, kach trumas meiser niteles ba'omedu v'machshava. And says the Gemara, ma truma gdola ba'ayin yafeh. The same is true by truma gdola. You can have an ayin yafeh. Av trumas meiser ba'ayin yafeh. You can give more than 10%. Lemaisa. How do we conclude our Gemara? We started with this assertion that perhaps we were discussing a case of Meiser when we were talking about Tormim Te'enim on 1/3 of the way down on on-the-Daf base. That's not what we were discussing. We were not discussing that, nor were we discussing Truma Gedola. We were talking about Trumas Meiser. And by Trumas Meiser, you're allowed to give Ba'ayin Yafeh. You can't be talking about Truma Gedola when Chazal say that the Ayin Yafeh is 1/40th and you give 1/10. You can't do that. The Ayin Yafeh is 1/40th. Pashut, you're not going to give 1/10 of your... That's not normal. You're running a business. It's not normal. You give what Chazal say. You want to be spitz, give 1/40th. Nobody's giving 1/10. Elamai, it must be talking about Trumas Meiser. And there you're allowed to give Ayin Yaf. And that's how we understand the Mishnah is. That if you give the grogeros by volume, it's Meiser. But if you hold that it's like the original and ripe version, it's more than 10%, don't worry. It's not regular Meiser. It's Trumas Meiser. And that can be done by Ayin Yafeh. That's how the Gemara clarifies itself over the course of the Amud. On the top of Nun Hey Amud Aleph, we're just going to get to the Mishnah Mirza Hashem. The Gemara says, Umina. Let's look at one of these lines. This is very interesting. This is kind of like an Omar Mar type of. Look at Rashi here. Umina. Klomar. Mehad Rebbe Lazar Gufa Maisi Pircha. We're going to ask a question from him himself. Amar Rebbe Lazar bar Reb Yossi. Abba Hayanotel Eser Grogro Shebimiktzah Tishim Shebekalkala. He would give, and now we know it's talking about Trumas Meiser. That's what we just concluded. That if you give 10 against 90, Amris Bishlama Lichimo Shehain Amrinon Shapir. If you want to say that it was like it was before, then it's good to go. Ela Amris Kimo Shehain. Oh, but we have a big problem. If you say that it's like it is right now, then and you counted, then batir lahu, then your Trumas Meiser will not be enough because you're counting. I have 10 grogros against 90 ripe ones. That's not Meiser. By volume, that's not Meiser. The grogros, you gave me 10 grogros. Each of them are 30% of the size, 50% of the size, whatever it is. It's much smaller. It says the Gemara, Ki asa Rav Dimi, Amar Rabbi Elazar, a fascinating din. Shiny grogros, not because we look at them how they were originally, but you could always reconstitute. And because you can always, it's not that we look at what was it like off the tree. Of course, it was ripe and large and full, and now it's yet. No, it's because I'm able to always reconstitute it. It still counts as Trumas Meiser, even though it doesn't look like Trumas Meiser. That sounds like a big kula to me. I'm asking, but it sounds like a cheap move for Trumas Meiser. I'm just going to give 10 grogros against my 90 fully ripe ones. The volume doesn't even get close. It's for sure not Meiser. It's for sure less than 10%. So says the Gemara, I don't care because I could reconstitute it. And we saw on the top of the Gemara that reconstituting is acceptable. That was the Mishnah that we saw in the Mishnah. Where was it? in Trumos. The Mishnah there says that reconstituting that was a tiyuvta to the sheet of yesh tichui bisura. No, that's that. We're all good to go. All right, next case. We're a quarter of the way down on Nunhayim Al. The Gemara says Tana Rabbanan. Tormin, we're allowed to do truma from te'ein al hagrogros. You're allowed to give ripe figs against dried figs. B'makom shirigilin la'asos te'enim grogros. When it's common to dehydrate them, that's fine. But v'lo grogros al te'enim, you're not allowed to give dried figs against ripe figs. Ve'afilu b'makom shirigilin la'asos te'enim grogros. Even in a place where you do dehydrate. And these two things you can already see if the cup is already questioning. These two things might be a steer on one another. Omar Mar, a third of the way down, the Gemara says as follows. We just said, Tormin te'einin al hagrogros, you're allowed to give ripe dates as a truma against ripe figs against dehydrated figs, b'makom shiragilin la'asos te'enim grogros, which implies b'makom shiragilin in, she'ein regilin lo. B'makom she'ein regilin lo. So says the Gemara, hechidami. What is the case that we're talking about when you're giving ripe figs, against dehydrated figs in a place where it's ragil? What do you mean that b'makom she'regilin in and b'makom she'ein regilin lo? Hechidami. Ika kohen. Even if there is a kohen there, then makom she'ein ragil amaylo. Even if it's not a place where you normally would dehydrate, you'd still give it to the kohen. Now, this is a din we wouldn't have known. It's not an intuitive din, but it's still here. V'atnan, because we have a Mishnah Maseches Trumos that makom sheyesh kohen. Whenever there is a kohen, tormin ayofeh. You're allowed to be tormin ayofeh. What was our case? Te'enim and grogros. Which one's yofeh? The te'enim are the yofeh. They're better because you can have them that way or dehydrate them pashat that they're yofeh. So when we're torem yafeh, you're allowed to be torem ala yafeh if there's a kohen present. So says the Gemara, Ella, it must be that the case that we just learned at the Tanu Rabbanan, a quarter of the way down, is pshita deleka kohen. It must be that we're talking about a case where there was no kohen there, because if there was a kohen, just give it to him. The Brisa left us a diuk that you're allowed to not give it to him, or you're not allowed to give it to him if it's a makom that you don't do te'enim to grogros. That's not true, Pashat. It's not true. It must be that there was no kohen there, because if there was a kohen, you would have had to give it to him. That's one side. But Amos Seifa says the Gemara, the second part of the Brisa was v'lo grogros al te'enim, that if we were giving dried figs against ripe figs, that's not allowed. Even in a place where it's common to dehydrate figs. So says the Gemara, I don't understand. If there is no kohen there, it should be mutter to do grogros al te'enim. Why? V'atnan. Makom she'ein kohen tor min amiskayim. Then you can use anything you want. Then you can use even the deficient product against, if there's no kohen, no problem at all. Elamai, the Seifa must be talking about where there was a kohen, because it says, it leaves room for the diuk, that it's only true, it's even true, I should say, b'makom sheragil asos te'enim v'grogros. But the Mishnah doesn't fit with that if there is a kohen there, then Torim min miskayim, even from a grogros onto te'enim. So the Gemara says, El pshita dika kohen. Asks the Gemara, Reisha, the case where we're Torim the te'enim on the grogros, Torim, Reisha, deleka kohen, and Seifa the ika kohen. The Reisha where we do te'enim towards grogros, we assume that there must have not been a kohen. The Seifa where we do grogros to te'enim, we assume there must have been a kohen. So says the Gemara, absolutely. Reisha deleka kohen, Seifa the ika kohen. This Mishnah that we have in Maseches Truma is completely split as to what the ukimta is. The first case, where you're giving te'enim in order to pater up grogeros, is where there's no kohen. The second case, where you're giving grogeros to pater up te'enim, is where there is a kohen. Why did we create the case that way? And this is such a big yesod throughout Shas. We've seen this before. Amar Rav Papa, how do we parse out Mishnayos when one piece seems to conflict with the other? Says the Gemara, Shma mina, what do we see from this answer? That the Reisha is where there was no Kohen, and the Seifa is where there is a Kohen. Shema mina that dachkinan umukminan masnisim betrei tame. It's better for us to touch up a Mishnah that the Reisha is one ukimta and the second is the other. Better to do that. V'lo mukminan betrei tanoi. It's better to do that than to say, this is Rav Meir and this is Rabbi Yehuda. This is Rabbi Akiva, this is Rabbi Eliezer. We don't want to do that. We don't want to create that machlokes. It's better to create ukimtas that the Reisha is talking about something different than the Seifa. And that is how our Gemara concludes over here. We'll stop right here. And Yirtzeh Hashem will pick up with a new Mishnah on the bottom of Nun Hey Amud Aleph tomorrow night. Wishing you all a beautiful night.